Hi guys, welcome to Train Forever. I'm Andrew Barr, and today we're going to be answering the question, should you train to failure? Now, these types of questions, it's always very important that we consider the question in the broader context of your training program and goals, which is why we'll be looking at this question in the context of a program focused on hypertrophy, maximum strength, and athletic performance. I'll get right to the point. No, training to failure, the vast majority of the time, is not a good training strategy. A fair follow-up question is, why? And if this is the case, why do so many people advocate training to failure if it's not a good idea? Let's start off by looking at training to failure in the context of a program focused on hypertrophy. And this makes sense because most of failure's proponents do come from that bodybuilding world. They might cite their own massive pumps that they get while training to failure, or perhaps reference their success by putting on size following that training method. If somebody's following a bro split where you do one muscle group once per week, training to failure actually makes some sense in that context. But we know that the bro split is not the best way to train for any goal. So it's a weak justification for failure training that it works well in the context of a flawed training method. So what does the science tell us about training to failure and putting on size? Adding muscle is tough to do, and it requires a lot of hard training, following a well-designed program, eating a lot, and prioritizing recovery. But in the context of the program itself, one of the most important variables is total weekly training volume as measured by the number of working sets per training week. There are limits to this, of course, but in general, more volume, more gains. So if we're trying to put on size, we want to design our training program and our microcycles around this idea of maximizing volume. Another related important variable is training frequency. Different muscles respond better to different training frequencies, but a good general rule is to train muscle groups twice per week. The main issue with training to failure is that it's so intense that it's difficult to recover from. If you train to failure in your first session of the week for a muscle group, you can and likely will compromise your ability to fully recover and thus accumulate more volume in your second training session of the week focused on that same muscle group. So instead of training all the way to failure, you train close to failure and leave 1 or 2 reps in the tank on most of your working sets. This way, you're still training at a high level and you'll be much more likely to sustain that level of high intensity over more volume throughout each training week. What about training to failure if your goal is maximum strength? Well, once again, it's not your best bet. And the rationale from the hypertrophy discussion about slightly reducing intensity in the spirit of optimizing the combination of intensity, frequency, and volume still applies. But to really understand why it's not a good idea, we have to recognize that strength is a skill, and that training to failure runs contrary to that idea of skill accumulation. Furthermore, training to failure with heavy barbell lifts like squats and bench press can be dangerous, and it imposes needless injury risk for no added benefit. Let's say your goal is to squat 500 pounds. How would you do that? Well, you would squat progressively heavier weight, and progress would be measured in successful lifts. Although we don't usually think about it in these terms, a failed rep or a missed rep is the opposite of a successful rep. So if our goal is to be successful in lifting the weight, why would we deliberately structure our program so that we were often failing or missing reps? For all movement skills, we adapt and develop in the way that we train. If we're deliberately missing or failing reps often, we are not preferentially developing the skill of being successful in lifting the weight. Failure training in heavy lifting poses some practical and injury risks as well. Missed reps in heavy squatting or heavy pressing are some of the moments in training with the greatest injury potential. As a lifter progresses through their training career, some missed reps are inevitable as you continue to challenge yourself in the name of progress. But there's a difference between occasionally missing a rep and structuring your program in the spirit of deliberately missing reps, thinking that that's the hardest and best that you can train. Leave a comment and let me know if you agree or disagree, or if you just have a question about training. I'll be happy to answer every one. Moving on to failure training in the context of athletic performance. The most important thing to understand about strength training in the context of a competitive athlete whose sport is something other than the weight room is that the weight room is very much secondary to the athlete's sport. The role of the strength coach and the role of the weight room in the athlete's program is to empower their success on the field of play. The worst thing that you can do as a strength coach working with athletes is to injure them. The second worst thing that you can do is to beat them up so badly in their workouts that it compromises their performance in games or even practices. Training to failure significantly increases recovery time and soreness, and it is not beneficial at all for increasing power, which is usually the central piece of a performance-focused program. If training to failure isn't the best way to train for any of these objectives, or in fact, any training objective, why is it so popular? I'm actually not 100% sure, but I do have some theories. One is that, objectively, failure training is the hardest you can train. You go to the point at which you cannot do any more work. And this idea of no pain, no gain, or give it 110% every session, what I like to call hardcore culture, this has really permeated the fitness and training space for many decades in spite of a mounting body of evidence against it. The next is that failure training works quite well in the context of a bro split, where you train each muscle group once per week. If you're training a muscle group once per week, it kind of makes sense to train it to failure because that muscle group then has a whole week to recover before you train it again. But the thing is, in the context of hypertrophy, we know that the bro split is an inferior training method. So the fact that failure makes the bro split work better is a weak justification at best because it's an inferior training method. So if our goal is to put on size, the research tells us that on average we want to train most of our muscle groups twice per week. And we also know that by just dialing back the intensity a little bit, leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank on most of our working sets, that will allow us to work at a higher level over the course of our training weeks and months, accumulating more volume and making more progress. It's important to point out that training to failure is not the devil, and if you occasionally miss a rep on squats, or if you're just in the zone and you want to get the biggest, baddest bicep pump you can by doing as many curls as possible, that's okay too. There's a big difference between doing something occasionally, either for fun or because it just happened to happen, versus deliberately structuring your training around this essentially a flawed training strategy. I hope you found today's video useful, and if you did, please give me a like and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another training tip. And if you head to the description, you can find my free guide to building core strength and my 12-week training program specifically for beginners, and you can find information about my online coaching as well. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week.